Rising 14,179 feet above the forests of Northern California, Mount Shasta dominates the landscape for 100 miles in every direction. This massive stratovolcano, crowned with glaciers that gleam in the sunlight, is visible from Interstate 5 as a solitary white pyramid against the sky. It has captivated human imagination for thousands of years. To the indigenous peoples who have lived in its shadow since time immemorial, it is a sacred mountain, a place of power and spiritual significance. To geologists, it is a potentially active volcano, part of the Cascade Range, with a complex eruptive history spanning hundreds of thousands of years. But to a surprising number of people, Mount Shasta is something else entirely. The home of a secret civilization living in vast chambers beneath the mountain, the refuge of survivors from lost continents, and a portal to hidden dimensions. The legends of Mount Shasta's hollow interior and its mysterious inhabitants form one of the most elaborate and persistent alternative history narratives in North America. Unlike many such stories that can be traced to a single hoax or book, the Shasta legends have multiple origins weaving together indigenous traditions. Occult philosophy, personal mystical experiences, and the region's genuine mystery and beauty into a tapestry of claims that has attracted spiritual seekers, curious tourists, and true believers for over a century. The stories vary in details but share common themes. Beneath the mountain, according to these accounts, exists a vast city called Telos, inhabited by the Lemurians, survivors of a lost continent that sank beneath the Pacific Ocean thousands of years ago. These beings are described as spiritually advanced, technologically sophisticated, and physically distinct from surface humans, often characterized as taller, with an ethereal or luminous quality. They supposedly emerge from the mountain at night, sometimes appearing in the town of Mount Shasta to purchase supplies using gold nuggets or mysterious currency. They are said to emit strange lights, create odd sounds within the mountain, and occasionally reveal themselves to spiritually prepared individuals who are ready to receive their wisdom. Other versions of the legend describe not Lemurians, but ascended masters, spiritually evolved beings who guide humanity's development from their hidden sanctuaries. Still others speak of surviving Atlanteans, extraterrestrial bases, interdimensional portals, or underground civilizations connected to a global network of hollow spaces within the Earth. The variations are endless, but all share the premise that Mount Shasta is far more than a beautiful mountain, and that beneath its familiar surface lies a hidden world of wonder and mystery. These are extraordinary claims, and as we will explore in depth, they are not supported by evidence. There is no credible documentation of a civilization living inside Mount Shasta. The geological structure of the mountain does not support the existence of vast hollow chambers. The supposed sightings of mysterious beings have mundane explanations or are unverifiable anecdotes. The entire edifice of Shasta mythology rests on a foundation of misunderstood indigenous traditions, creative fiction, spiritual experiences interpreted literally, and the human tendency to project meaning onto landscapes we find awesome and beautiful. Yet the legends persist and even flourish. The town of Mount Shasta, California, at the mountain's base, has become a nexus for spiritual seekers, New Age practitioners, and those drawn by the mountain's alleged mysteries. Bookstores sell volumes about Lemurians and ascended masters. Tour companies offer visits to supposedly significant locations. Meditation groups gather at power spots on the mountain's slopes. The legends have become part of the region's identity and economy, a living mythology that shapes how many people experience this magnificent place. Before we examine the origins, evolution, and problems with these legends, before we explore what the mountain actually is versus what people imagine it to be, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us investigate these fascinating cultural phenomena with the depth and critical analysis they deserve. Now let us journey into the mystery of Mount Shasta, examining not just the claims about what lies beneath the mountain, but the equally interesting question of why such stories arise, why they persist, and what they reveal about the human relationship with sacred landscapes and the allure of hidden knowledge. To understand the legends of Mount Shasta, we must first understand the mountain as it actually exists. A massive volcano with a complex geological history, situated in a region of extraordinary natural beauty that has drawn human reverence for millennia. Mount Shasta is a stratovolcano, also called a composite volcano, built from layers of hardened lava, tephra, pumice, and volcanic ash deposited during repeated eruptions over hundreds of thousands of years. It is the second highest peak in the Cascade Range, after Mount Rainier in Washington and the fifth highest in California. The mountain rises with dramatic abruptness from the surrounding landscape, its base elevation beginning around 3,600 feet and its summit reaching 14,179 feet, creating an elevation gain visible from vast distances. The current mountain is actually a complex of 4 overlapping volcanic cones built over a period spanning at least 590,000 years. The oldest visible cone is the Sergeant's Ridge cone on the south side. The main cone that forms the mountain's iconic shape is Hotlam Cone, approximately 8,000 years old. Shastina, a prominent satellite cone on the west side, last erupted approximately 9,500 years ago and creates the mountain's distinctive twin-peaked appearance when viewed from certain angles. The youngest cone is a small feature on the north side called the North Gate. Mount Shasta is considered an active volcano, though it has not erupted since 1786, when a small eruption was reportedly witnessed by French explorer Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de la Pérouse, from his ship off the California coast. Geological evidence shows that Shasta has erupted on average every 600 to 800 years during the Holocene epoch, the current geological period spanning the last 11,700 years. The most recent significant eruption occurred around 1250 CE, producing lava flows and pyroclastic materials. The volcano is monitored by the U.S. Geological Survey, which considers future eruptions likely, though their timing is unpredictable. The mountain is heavily glaciated, with 7 named glaciers descending from near the summit. The largest, Whitney Glacier, is the longest glacier in California and contains the state's only glacier-formed icefall. These glaciers are remnants of the last ice age, and are slowly receding due to climate change, though they remain substantial features that give the mountain its year-round, snow-covered appearance. The glacial meltwater feeds numerous streams and rivers, including the headwaters of the Sacramento River, making Shasta ecologically significant beyond its visual grandeur. The geology of Mount Shasta is incompatible with the hollow mountain legends. Stratovolcanoes are solid structures built from layer upon layer of hardened volcanic materials. While they may contain some void spaces, small caves formed by lava tubes or gas pockets, the idea of vast hollow chambers capable of housing a city is geologically impossible in this type of volcanic structure. Magma chambers exist beneath active volcanoes, but these are filled with molten or semi-molten rock, not empty space suitable for habitation. The mountain does contain some caves, formed by lava tubes where the surface of lava flows cooled and hardened while molten lava continued to flow beneath, eventually draining away to leave hollow tubes. The most extensive of these is Pluto's Cave, a lava tube on the mountain's north side extending about 1,140 feet. While interesting to speleologists and visitors, these lava tubes are small features, nothing like the vast caverns described in the hollow mountain legends. They are explored and mapped, and they contain no hidden civilizations. The mountain's climate is harsh and challenging. The summit experiences extreme cold, high winds, and severe storms. The tree line is around 8,000 feet, above which vegetation becomes sparse and eventually gives way to rock, snow, and ice. The slopes are subject to avalanches, rockfall, and sudden weather changes. While experienced mountaineers regularly climb Shasta, it is a serious undertaking requiring proper equipment and skills. The idea of a hidden entrance to underground realms somewhere on these exposed slopes raises immediate practical questions. Where could such an entrance exist without being discovered by the thousands of climbers who traverse the mountain annually? The surrounding landscape enhances the mountain's dramatic presence. To the south lie the forested slopes and volcanic features of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. To the north, the Shasta Valley stretches toward Oregon, with Mount Shasta dominating the southern horizon. To the east, the high desert plateaus of the Modoc region extend toward Nevada. To the west, the Klamath Mountains create a rugged wilderness. This geographic isolation, with Shasta rising alone rather than as part of a continuous mountain range, contributes to its visual impact and perhaps to its mystique. The region's geology also includes numerous smaller volcanic features: cinder cones, lava flows, hot springs, and the remnants of ancient calderas. Medicine Lake Volcano, located about 30 miles east of Mount Shasta, is a massive shield volcano with a complex system of lava tubes and volcanic caves, including Lava Beds National Monument, which contains over 800 caves. This volcanic landscape creates an environment where natural underground features are common, which may contribute to speculation about hidden chambers and passages. Long before the modern legends of Lemurians and hollow mountains arose, the indigenous peoples of the Shasta region maintained profound spiritual relationships with the mountain. Understanding these genuine traditions is essential, both to respect the actual sacred significance of the mountain and to see how these traditions have been misappropriated and distorted in the creation of modern legends. The mountain has been known by various indigenous names. The Karak people called it Itahku, the Klamath people knew it as Mulewakshi, the Modoc called it Wamshashtak, and the Wintu people referred to it as Bulium Pyok or Watam Pinam. Each of these names reflects specific cultural relationships and traditional knowledge about the mountain, its spiritual significance, and its role in creation stories and ceremonial practices. For the Wintu people, whose traditional territory includes the western and northern slopes of Mount Shasta, the mountain is the center of creation, the place where the world began. Their creation stories describe the Creator and other sacred beings dwelling on the mountain and creating the landscape, plants, animals, and people from its summit. The mountain is understood not as a hollow shell containing hidden civilizations, but as a living sacred presence, the foundation of the world and the dwelling place of spiritual powers. The Karak, Shasta, Modoc, and other regional tribes similarly maintain traditions of the mountain as sacred, as the home of powerful spirits, and as a place requiring respect and proper protocol. Certain areas of the mountain are traditionally restricted, not because they contain physical entrances to underground cities, but because they are spiritually powerful places where only properly trained spiritual practitioners should venture. A recurring element in various indigenous traditions involves the mountain's springs, particularly those on the mountain's slopes, which are considered sacred and healing. The waters emerging from Mount Shasta are understood to carry spiritual power, and certain springs have been used ceremonially for countless generations. This reverence for springs and water sources from the mountain reflects both practical importance and spiritual significance. These traditions are about relationship with the mountain as it is, not about speculation about what might be hidden inside it. It is crucial to note that genuine indigenous traditions about Mount Shasta do not include stories of Lemurians, lost continents, or technologically advanced beings living in underground cities. These elements are modern inventions, not indigenous knowledge. When proponents of the Hollow Shasta legends claim they are based on Native American traditions, they are either misunderstanding, misrepresenting, or deliberately distorting indigenous spiritual concepts. Some indigenous traditions do speak of powerful beings associated with the mountain, but these are understood as spiritual entities, not as physical beings living in underground chambers. The Wintu tradition includes stories of beings that might be called spirits or powers in English, but they are not described as survivors from Atlantis or Lemuria running an underground civilization. The category confusion between spiritual beings in indigenous cosmology and the physical hidden civilizations described in modern legends is profound. Moreover, indigenous peoples have repeatedly stated that their sacred traditions are being appropriated and misrepresented by the spiritual seekers and New Age practitioners who have flooded to Mount Shasta. The claim that modern hollow mountain legends are somehow validating or based on indigenous knowledge is insulting to indigenous communities whose actual traditions are being ignored in favor of fabricated alternatives. The Winnemem Wintu, one of the tribes with ancestral connections to the Mount Shasta region, have been particularly vocal about the appropriation of their sacred sites and the misrepresentation of their traditions. They have stated clearly that the mountain is sacred in its own right, not because it contains hidden civilizations, and that the New Age activities and legends are disrespectful to the mountain and to indigenous spiritual practices. Understanding the genuine indigenous relationship with Mount Shasta enriches our appreciation of the mountain far more than invented legends do. The indigenous traditions speak of thousands of years of reverence, of deep knowledge about the mountain's ecology and geology developed through generations of living in relationship with it, and of spiritual practices grounded in respect for the mountain as a living sacred presence. This is profound and meaningful in ways that stories about underground Lemurians, invented in the 20th century, can never be. When Euro-American explorers and settlers first encountered Mount Shasta in the early 19th century, they were immediately struck by its grandeur and visual dominance. The mountain became a landmark for travelers, a source of water for settlers, and inevitably a subject of speculation and storytelling. The first documented European sighting of Mount Shasta was by Peter Skeeny Ogden, a Hudson's Bay Company explorer in 1826. He noted the mountain in his journal, describing it as an impressive peak visible from great distances. Over the following decades, as fur trappers, explorers, and eventually settlers moved into the region, the mountain appeared in numerous accounts, usually described in terms of its size and beauty. The mountain's name is likely derived from the Shasta people, though the exact etymology is debated. Some sources suggest it was named by French trappers. The name was in use by American settlers by the 1840s, and the nearby town of Shasta, a gold rush boomtown, helped establish the name firmly. The mountain has been officially called Mount Shasta since the mid-19th century. Early settlers in the region heard indigenous stories about the mountain's spiritual significance, but these were typically filtered through cultural misunderstanding and the tendency to romanticize or exoticize indigenous traditions. When native peoples spoke of the mountain as sacred or as the dwelling place of spirits, Euro-American listeners sometimes interpreted this literally as claims about physical beings living inside the mountain, a misinterpretation that would later feed into the Lemurian legends. The California Gold Rush brought thousands of people to Northern California in the late 1840s and 1850s, and Mount Shasta became a familiar landmark for those traveling the Siskiyou Trail connecting California to Oregon. The mountain's isolation and dramatic appearance began to inspire speculation. Some travelers claimed to see mysterious lights on the mountain at night. Others reported odd sounds emanating from the peak. Most of these reports probably had mundane explanations: campfires of climbers, rockfall, the sounds of ice breaking from glaciers, but they contributed to a growing sense that the mountain held mysteries. In the 1870s and 1880s, as spiritualism and occult philosophy became popular in America and Europe, Mount Shasta began to attract attention from those interested in mystical and esoteric matters. The mountain's imposing presence, its association with indigenous spirituality, and its relative remoteness made it an attractive location for those seeking places of spiritual power. It was in this environment, late 19th and early 20th century America, with its mixture of displaced indigenous peoples, arriving settlers, spiritual seeking, and romantic fascination with mysterious landscapes, that the specific legends of Hollow Mount Shasta began to take shape. But they did not emerge fully formed from indigenous traditions or from settler observations. They were created through specific acts of writing, by specific individuals who wove together various threads into the elaborate mythology that persists today. The story of Lemuria, the lost continent whose survivors supposedly live beneath Mount Shasta, requires us to understand how a legitimate scientific hypothesis was transformed into occult mythology and eventually connected to a California mountain. The name Lemuria originated in 19th century zoology and geology. In the 1860s, English zoologist Philip Sclater noted that lemurs, primates native to Madagascar, had fossil relatives in India but were absent from Africa and the Middle East. To explain this distribution, Sclater hypothesized a now-sunken continent in the Indian Ocean that had once connected Madagascar, India, and Southeast Asia, allowing lemurs to disperse before the landmass sank. He called this hypothetical landmass Lemuria. This was legitimate scientific speculation in its time, proposed to explain a genuine puzzle in biogeography before the theory of plate tectonics and continental drift provided better explanations. But as more evidence accumulated, it became clear that Lemuria, as Sclater imagined it, had never existed. Plate tectonics explained lemur distribution through the breakup of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent, without requiring a sunken Indian Ocean continent. By the early 20th century, Lemuria had been discarded by science. However, before science abandoned Lemuria, the concept was appropriated by occultists and spiritualists who transformed it into something completely different. Madame Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical movement, incorporated Lemuria into her elaborate cosmology described in her 1888 book, The Secret Doctrine. In Blavatsky's version, Lemuria was not a zoological land bridge, but one of several ancient continents inhabited by successive root races of humanity evolving towards spiritual perfection. Blavatsky's Lemuria was located in the Pacific Ocean rather than the Indian, and her Lemurians were not ordinary humans, but spiritually and physically different beings, part of the third root race in her scheme of human evolution. She claimed to derive her knowledge from ancient texts and from psychic revelation, though she provided no evidence that would satisfy anyone demanding verification. Her Lemuria was pure invention, occult philosophy dressed in quasi-scientific language. Theosophical ideas, including the Lemuria concept, spread widely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, influencing various spiritual and occult movements. The idea of ancient advanced civilizations that had been destroyed in cataclysms, but whose wisdom survived in hidden forms, appealed to people dissatisfied with materialism and mainstream religion. Lemuria, along with Atlantis, became a staple of alternative spirituality. The connection between Lemuria and Mount Shasta appears to have been made in the early 20th century, though pinpointing exactly when and by whom is difficult because the story evolved through oral tradition and informal networks before being extensively documented in published sources. The key figure in popularizing the Mount Shasta Lemurian story was Frederick Spencer Oliver, but his contribution came through a strange and convoluted path. The foundational text for the Mount Shasta mystical legends is A Dweller on Two Planets, a book that was written in the 1880s but not published until 1905 after the author's death. The book's author, Frederick Spencer Oliver, and the circumstances of its creation are as strange as the content itself. Frederick Spencer Oliver was born in 1866 and spent his youth in the Mount Shasta region, living in the town of Eureka in the Shasta Valley. In 1883, when he was just 17 years old, Oliver claimed to have begun receiving dictation from a spiritual entity named Philos the Thibton, an ascended master who revealed to him the story of Atlantis, reincarnation, and esoteric spiritual truths. Over several years, Oliver transcribed what Philos allegedly communicated, producing the manuscript that would become A Dweller on Two Planets. The book is a complex narrative describing ancient Atlantis, its advanced technology that sounds remarkably like 19th century predictions about future inventions, electric lights, airships, wireless communication, its moral failings, and its eventual destruction. The narrative includes multiple lifetimes of the protagonist through reincarnation, esoteric teachings about spiritual evolution, and descriptions of hidden masters guiding humanity's development from secret retreats in remote mountains. Mount Shasta appears in the book as a sacred mountain and as a place where the ascended masters maintain a retreat. Oliver describes the mountain as a place of power and suggests hidden chambers within it, though the specific details about Lemurians living inside Shasta in the elaborate form the legend would later take are not fully developed in his book. Oliver's contribution was establishing Shasta as a location of occult significance and connecting it to the idea of hidden masters. Oliver died in 1899 at the young age of 33, and his manuscript was published posthumously in 1905 by his mother. The book found an audience among those interested in theosophy, spiritualism, and occult philosophy. While not a bestseller in the conventional sense, it circulated within esoteric circles and influenced subsequent writers and spiritual seekers who would elaborate on its themes. What is significant about Oliver's book for our purposes is that it was presented not as fiction, but as revealed truth, as spiritual history channeled from higher beings. This framing encouraged readers to take its contents literally, to believe that Oliver's descriptions of Atlantis and the hidden masters were accurate accounts rather than imaginative creation. The book established a template, Mount Shasta as a place of hidden mysteries, inhabited or visited by spiritually advanced beings who possess ancient wisdom and advanced knowledge. Oliver's work was the seed from which the elaborate Shasta mythology would grow, but the full flowering would come through subsequent writers, spiritual teachers, and the gradual accumulation of stories, claimed sightings, and elaborations that transformed Oliver's vision into the detailed Lemurian legends we know today. Following the publication of A Dweller on Two Planets, the association between Mount Shasta and occult mysteries became established in the spiritual seeker community. Over the following decades, the legend grew through the contributions of various individuals and movements, each adding details and elaborations. In the 1920s and 1930s, stories began to circulate about a hidden city called Telos inside Mount Shasta, inhabited by Lemurians who had fled the destruction of their Pacific continent thousands of years ago. These Lemurians were described as tall, graceful beings with enhanced spiritual and psychic abilities, living in a technologically advanced underground civilization while occasionally emerging to interact with surface dwellers. Where did the name Telos come from? The etymology is unclear, but it may be derived from Greek telos, meaning end or purpose, fitting with the theosophical framework of spiritual evolution toward a goal. The name appears in various early 20th century occult writings, though pinpointing its first application to the supposed city under Shasta is difficult due to the oral nature of much early legend transmission. Stories about encounters with Lemurians in the town of Mount Shasta began to circulate. According to these accounts, tall, robed figures would occasionally appear in local stores, purchasing supplies with gold nuggets or unusual currency. They spoke little, moved with unusual grace, and vanished mysteriously when followed. Storekeepers who supposedly witnessed these visits reported feeling awed or peaceful in the being's presence. These encounter stories are unverified and probably apocryphal, classic urban legends that circulated and were embellished with each retelling. No contemporary newspaper accounts, police reports, or other documentation supports claims of mysterious beings purchasing supplies in Mount Shasta, despite these stories supposedly occurring in a small town where such unusual visitors would certainly attract official attention and be documented. The 1930s saw another major contribution to the Shasta mythology through the work of Guy Ballard and the I Am Activity movement, which we will examine in detail shortly. But before we get to Ballard, it is worth noting that by 1930, the basic framework of the modern Shasta legend was in place. The mountain as hollow inhabited by Lemurian survivors from a lost Pacific continent living in a hidden city, occasionally emerging and maintaining spiritual advancement while waiting for the time when surface humanity would be ready to receive their wisdom. This framework drew on multiple sources: Blavatsky's Theosophical Lemuria, Oliver's vision of Mount Shasta as an ascended master retreat, the general late 19th and early 20th century fascination with lost civilizations and hidden wisdom, and the projection of spiritual seeking onto a landscape that seemed mysterious and powerful. None of it was based on archaeological evidence, geological investigation, or verifiable observation. It was a collective, imaginative creation, a modern mythology built from spiritual yearning and the human tendency to populate awesome landscapes with sacred meaning. If Frederick Spencer Oliver planted the seed of Mount Shasta's mystical significance, Guy Ballard, and the religious movement he founded cultivated it into full bloom. The I Am activity, which Ballard established in the 1930s, became one of the most influential forces in spreading and elaborating the Mount Shasta legends, and its impact on the region's spiritual culture persists to this day. Guy Ballard was born in 1878 in Kansas and spent his early life working various jobs, including mining, prospecting, and business ventures, none of which brought him lasting success or financial stability. By his late 40s, Ballard was struggling financially and searching for meaning in his life. He had become interested in theosophy and occult philosophy, reading widely in esoteric literature, including Frederick Spencer Oliver's A Dweller on Two Planets. In 1930, Ballard traveled to Mount Shasta, reportedly for business reasons related to mining claims in the area. According to the account, he would later publish under the pseudonym Godfrey Ray King. What happened during this visit would change his life and launch a religious movement that would attract hundreds of thousands of followers. Ballard claimed that on a hike on the slopes of Mount Shasta, he encountered a young man who offered him a cup of liquid that Ballard initially thought was cold water, but which turned out to be a miraculous substance that filled him with energy and vitality. The young man then revealed himself as the ascended master Saint Germain, a figure from theosophical lore said to be a spiritually evolved being who had lived many lifetimes and now guided humanity from beyond the physical plane. According to Ballard's account, Saint Germain took him to a hidden retreat within Mount Shasta where he met other ascended masters and was shown visions of past civilizations, including Atlantis and Lemuria. Saint Germain revealed to Ballard that he had been chosen to bring the teachings of the ascended masters to humanity through a new dispensation called the I Am activity. Over subsequent months, Ballard claimed to receive further communications from Saint Germain and other ascended masters, which he transcribed into the books that would become the foundation texts of his movement. The first of these books, Unveiled Mysteries, was published in 1934 under the pen name Godfrey Ray King. It detailed Ballard's supposed encounters with Saint Germain and the teachings he received. The book was written in a breathless, dramatic style, describing spectacular visions, ancient civilizations, cosmic battles between good and evil, and the hidden masters working to elevate humanity towards spiritual perfection. Mount Shasta featured prominently in Ballard's narrative. He described secret chambers and temples within the mountain where the ascended masters gathered, where ancient wisdom was preserved, and where initiates could experience spiritual transformation. He claimed to have been taken into these hidden spaces, to have witnessed ceremonies and teachings, and to have been shown the underground city where advanced beings lived in splendor and harmony. Ballard's description of the interior of Mount Shasta was remarkably detailed and vivid. He wrote of rooms with walls of polished marble, illuminated by a soft, sourceless light. He described vast libraries containing the wisdom of lost civilizations, laboratories where ascended masters conducted experiments in spiritual science, and meeting halls where councils of enlightened beings discussed the fate of humanity. He claimed to have seen technology far beyond anything known to surface civilization, devices that could project three-dimensional images, systems that could transport people instantly across great distances, and machines that could heal illness and extend life indefinitely. These descriptions were, of course, entirely unverifiable. Ballard provided no photographs, no physical evidence, no witnesses other than his own testimony. But his vivid writing and his apparent sincerity convinced many readers that his experiences were genuine. Unveiled Mysteries became a bestseller within occult and metaphysical circles, and Ballard followed it with additional books expanding on the teachings, The Magic Presence, The I Am Discourses, and others. With his wife Edna and son Donald, Ballard established the I Am activity as a formal organization in 1932. The movement combined elements from Theosophy, New Thought, and Christian mysticism into a distinctive teaching centered on the concept of the I Am Presence, the divine spark within each person that could be activated through specific practices and invocations. The movement taught that by calling upon the ascended masters, particularly Saint Germain, and by using specific affirmations and visualizations, followers could manifest abundance, health, and spiritual advancement. The I Am activity grew rapidly through the 1930s. Ballard and his wife traveled the country giving lectures and conducting classes that attracted thousands of attendees. They established reading groups and study centers in cities across America. By the late 1930s, the movement claimed hundreds of thousands of members, making it one of the largest new religious movements of the era. Central to the I Am activity's appeal was its association with Mount Shasta. The mountain became a pilgrimage destination for followers who traveled to California hoping to experience their own encounters with the ascended masters. The I Am activity organized summer camps and gatherings on the mountain's slopes where members could meditate, perform rituals, and seek spiritual experiences in the location where Ballard had supposedly met Saint Germain. These gatherings helped establish Mount Shasta as a permanent spiritual center. Local businesses in the town of Mount Shasta began catering to spiritual seekers, and the economy of the small logging and railroad town gradually became intertwined with the metaphysical tourism the I Am activity encouraged. Even after Ballard's death in 1939 and the subsequent decline of the I Am activity as an organization, the association between Mount Shasta and spiritual seeking that the movement had established persisted and grew. Guy Ballard's contribution to the Mount Shasta mythology cannot be overstated. While Frederick Spencer Oliver had suggested that ascended masters had a retreat on the mountain, Ballard provided detailed descriptions of what supposedly existed inside it, gave the hidden realm a specific character and purpose, and most importantly, claimed personal experience rather than channeled revelation. His narrative was presented not as ancient history or spiritual allegory, but as contemporary events, things that were happening now that could potentially happen to anyone who was spiritually prepared. This immediacy and accessibility made the legend more compelling and more actionable. Instead of being a fascinating story about the distant past, the Hollow Mountain became a present reality, a place where seekers could potentially have their own transformative experiences. The mountain shifted from being merely a sacred site to being an active spiritual center where hidden masters were working right now to guide humanity's evolution. However, we must note several significant problems with Ballard's account. First, it was completely unverifiable and rested entirely on his word. No independent witnesses confirmed his encounters. No physical evidence supported his claims. The detailed descriptions of the mountain's interior contradicted everything known about the geology of stratovolcanoes. Second, Ballard had clear financial motivations for promoting his story. The I Am activity generated substantial income through book sales, lecture fees, and donations from members. Ballard and his family lived quite comfortably from the movement's revenues, a fact that would later attract the attention of federal authorities. Third, Ballard's teachings contained elements that many observers considered problematic, including intolerance toward other spiritual traditions, authoritarian control over members, and increasingly grandiose claims about the movement's cosmic significance. After Ballard's death, the I Am activity faced legal challenges from the federal government over mail fraud charges related to claims made in fundraising materials, though these charges were eventually overturned on First Amendment grounds. Fourth, the specific figure of Saint Germain that Ballard claimed to have met was drawn from European occult traditions and theosophical lore, where the Count of Saint Germain was a real 18th century European courtier and adventurer who had been mythologized into an immortal master of wisdom. Ballard's innovation was to bring this European figure to Mount Shasta and to claim contemporary encounters rather than distant historical interactions. Finally, Ballard's descriptions of the mountain's interior included elements that seem clearly borrowed from science fiction and fantasy literature of the period, as well as from theosophical descriptions of advanced civilizations. The technology he described, the architectural features, the social organization, all resembled contemporary imaginings of utopian societies rather than anything with historical or anthropological plausibility. Despite these problems, Ballard's influence was profound and lasting. He established a narrative template that would be repeated and elaborated by subsequent writers and teachers. The mountain contains hidden chambers. These chambers house spiritually and technologically advanced beings. These beings occasionally interact with surface dwellers, and properly prepared individuals can potentially gain access to this hidden world. This template would shape virtually all subsequent Mount Shasta mythology. After Guy Ballard's death in 1939, the I Am activity continued under the leadership of his widow Edna Ballard, but its explosive growth period had ended. However, the association between Mount Shasta and spiritual mysteries that the movement had helped establish continued to attract seekers, and new teachers, writers, and movements arose to elaborate on and modify the basic legend. The 1940s and 1950s saw relatively quiet development of the Shasta mythology, with the legend circulating primarily within occult and metaphysical communities. Books about the mountain's mysteries appeared sporadically, usually self-published or released by small esoteric presses. The town of Mount Shasta maintained a small but steady stream of spiritual seekers who came hoping to experience encounters with hidden masters or to meditate in the supposedly powerful energy of the mountain. The 1960s and 1970s brought renewed and intensified interest as the counterculture movement and the New Age movement created a much larger audience for alternative spirituality. Mount Shasta became a destination not just for dedicated occultists, but for the broader spiritual-seeking public, young people experimenting with meditation and consciousness expansion, dropouts from mainstream society seeking alternative lifestyles, and middle-class Americans exploring Eastern religions and metaphysical practices. During this period, several important elaborations and modifications to the basic legend emerged. While earlier versions of the story had focused primarily on ascended masters and their spiritual teachings, new versions increasingly emphasized the Lemurian element, the idea that the mountain housed survivors of a lost Pacific continent who maintained an advanced civilization in hidden chambers. The name Telos became firmly established as the designation for the underground city. Various channelers and psychic teachers claimed to receive communications from beings in Telos, providing increasingly detailed descriptions of the city's layout, technology, society, and purposes. These accounts described Telos as a vast metropolis occupying multiple levels beneath Mount Shasta, housing anywhere from tens of thousands to millions of Lemurian inhabitants. According to these elaborated accounts, Telos was built by Lemurian refugees who foresaw the destruction of their continent and evacuated to various locations, with Mount Shasta being one of several refuges. The city was said to be constructed using advanced technology unknown to surface civilization, crystalline power sources, teleportation systems, and methods of working with stone and metal through sound or thought rather than physical tools. The Lemurians themselves were described with increasing specificity. They were said to be taller than average surface humans, typically between 7 and 8 feet tall, with refined features and an ethereal quality to their appearance. Some accounts described them as having slightly different biological characteristics, larger eyes, different metabolic processes, or the ability to shift between physical and light body forms. They were invariably described as spiritually advanced, telepathic, and possessing healing abilities and other psychic powers. The society of Telos was portrayed as utopian, a civilization that had solved the problems that plague surface humanity. There was no poverty, no crime, no war in Telos. The Lemurians governed themselves through councils of elders who made decisions based on spiritual wisdom rather than political conflict. They devoted their time to spiritual development, artistic creation, and scientific research rather than to the struggles for survival and power that dominate surface society. According to the legend, the Lemurians maintained their hidden existence not out of fear or hostility towards surface humans, but out of spiritual wisdom. Surface humanity was not yet ready for the knowledge and power the Lemurians possessed. Premature revelation would be dangerous, leading to misuse of advanced technology and spiritual teachings. The Lemurians waited patiently for humanity to evolve sufficiently that contact could be beneficial rather than destructive. However, the Lemurians did not remain completely isolated. They supposedly sent emissaries to the surface world, individuals who could pass as human and who worked quietly to guide humanity's spiritual evolution. They also selectively revealed themselves to spiritually advanced surface humans who were ready to receive teachings and who could help prepare humanity for eventual open contact. This framework explained why the Lemurians had not been discovered despite their supposed proximity to a major highway and populated areas. They maintained their concealment through advanced technology, cloaking devices, holographic projections, or vibrational frequencies that made their entrances invisible to those not spiritually attuned. They carefully controlled who could access Telos, using psychic abilities to recognize and invite prepared individuals while remaining undetectable to skeptics and the unprepared. The legend also incorporated increasingly elaborate connections to other alternative history and metaphysical concepts. Telos was linked to a supposed global network of underground cities housing various advanced civilizations. The Lemurians were connected to ancient astronaut theories, sometimes described as having extraterrestrial origins or connections. The mountain became associated with concepts like ley lines, Earth energy grids, and vortexes, invisible lines and points of concentrated spiritual power crisscrossing the planet. UFO sightings around Mount Shasta, and the area does have a history of such reports, were reinterpreted as evidence of Lemurian activity. The mysterious lights, sometimes seen on the mountain at night, were claimed to be Lemurian craft or technology rather than the mundane explanations of headlamps from climbers, atmospheric phenomena, or simple misidentifications. A crucial element in the evolution and persistence of the Mount Shasta legends has been the role of channelers, individuals who claim to receive communications from beings in Telos or from ascended masters associated with the mountain. These channeled messages have provided much of the specific content that believers accept as information about the hidden civilization. Channeling, the practice of serving as a medium through which non-physical entities communicate, has a long history in Western spirituality, from the spiritualist mediums of the 19th century to the trance channelers of the New Age movement. In the context of Mount Shasta, channeling has served to continually update and elaborate the legend, adding new details and responding to changes in the broader spiritual culture. One of the most influential channelers was Godfrey Ray King, Guy Ballard's pen name, whose books contained purported direct communications from Saint Germain and other ascended masters. But Ballard was far from the last. Throughout the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, numerous individuals have claimed to channel beings from Telos or masters associated with Mount Shasta. These channeled communications typically follow certain patterns. The entities identify themselves by name, often names with vaguely exotic or ancient-sounding qualities. Common names include Adama, described as the high priest of Telos, Arnoma, said to be a Lemurian elder, and various ascended masters including Saint Germain, Master Hilarion, and others from theosophical tradition. The messages usually begin with greetings expressing love and encouragement, assuring the reader or listener of the entity's benevolent intentions and their desire to help humanity. The tone is invariably positive, gentle, and uplifting, emphasizing themes of love, light, spiritual evolution, and the approaching transformation of human consciousness. The content of channeled messages from Telos typically includes several standard elements. There are descriptions of life in the underground city, providing details about daily activities, social structures, and technologies. There are teachings about spiritual development, meditation practices, and methods for raising consciousness. There are prophecies or predictions about future events, often involving some form of coming transformation or ascension of humanity to a higher dimensional plane. Importantly, the messages also explain why the Lemurians remain hidden and why they cannot simply reveal themselves openly. The explanations usually invoke concepts like spiritual readiness, vibrational frequencies, or divine timing. Humanity must reach a certain level of consciousness before open contact can occur. Surface humans must raise their vibrations to match those of the Lemurians. The time for revelation is approaching, but has not yet arrived. This last element is psychologically crucial because it explains the continued absence of evidence while maintaining hope that evidence will eventually appear. The prophecy is self-insulating. It cannot be disproven because its fulfillment is always in the future, always just beyond the horizon, always dependent on conditions that believers can claim are not yet met. One of the most prolific and influential channelers of Telos material has been Shasta Dux, who claimed in the 1990s to actually be a princess from Telos who had chosen to live on the surface world. Dux, working with various collaborators, produced books and gave lectures describing life in Telos in extraordinary detail. The city's layout with its various levels and districts, the educational system, the gardens that grew food using hydroponic technology, the healing temples, and the councils of governance. Dux's descriptions were remarkably specific and vivid, creating a detailed picture of Lemurian society that became widely accepted within the believing community. She described herself as having been born in Telos, raised there until adulthood, and then sent to the surface to live among humans as part of a program to help bridge the gap between the two civilizations. However, skeptical investigators found numerous inconsistencies and problems with Dux's account. Her biography contained elements that contradicted her claim to be from Telos, documented evidence of her surface existence before the time she claimed to have emerged from underground. When questioned about specific details, she sometimes provided answers that contradicted previous statements or that revealed ignorance of basic facts about the Mount Shasta region that someone raised there should have known. Despite these problems, Dux's material became influential because it provided the level of detail that believers craved. Instead of vague references to a hidden city, here was a comprehensive description from someone claiming first-hand experience. The material was marketed through books, lectures, and workshops, creating a commercial ecosystem around the Telos legend. Another significant channeler is Aurelia Louise Jones, who authored a series of books titled Telos, beginning in the early 2000s, claiming to channel the Lemurian master Adama. Jones' work became particularly influential in the 21st century Mount Shasta spiritual community, providing voluminous teachings on Lemurian history, spiritual practices, and the supposedly imminent ascension of humanity. Jones' channeled material described the history of Lemuria in great detail, from its origins as a continent in the Pacific to its destruction in a cataclysm involving the misuse of advanced technology and conflict with Atlantis. She described how survivors escaped to Mount Shasta and other locations, building underground cities and waiting through thousands of years for the time when humanity would be ready for reunion. The teachings emphasized personal spiritual development as preparation for contact with the Lemurians. Followers were encouraged to meditate, practice forgiveness, raise their consciousness, and prepare themselves to serve as bridges between the surface world and Telos. This focus on personal transformation rather than external proof made the teachings appealing while simultaneously explaining why most people never experienced direct contact. They simply were not yet ready. What all these channeled sources share is that they are completely unverifiable and rest entirely on the word of the channeler. There is no method to confirm that the communications are actually coming from the claimed sources rather than from the channeler's own imagination. The information provided cannot be independently checked against any objective standard. The entities being channeled conveniently never provide information that could be verified or falsified, no specific predictions that could be tested, no claims about the physical world that could be investigated, no physical evidence that could be examined. This makes channeled material particularly problematic from an evidential standpoint. It is essentially indistinguishable from fiction, creative writing in which the author attributes the content to imaginary sources. Some channelers may be deliberately fraudulent, knowingly making up the material for profit or attention. Others may genuinely believe they are in contact with external entities, experiencing psychological phenomena like dissociation or imaginative absorption that feel like external communication, but are actually internally generated. From a scholarly perspective, channeled material is interesting as cultural production and as psychological phenomenon, but it cannot be treated as evidence for the existence of Telos or Lemurians. It tells us about the beliefs, desires, and imaginative creations of contemporary spiritual seekers, but it does not tell us anything about hidden civilizations in Mount Shasta. Beyond the channeled communications, believers in the Mount Shasta legends point to various claimed encounters and sightings as evidence that the hidden civilization is real. These reports, accumulating over decades, form an important part of the legend's persistence and appeal. Examining them reveals patterns common to many types of anomalous experience claims. One of the most common types of report involves mysterious lights seen on or around Mount Shasta. Witnesses describe seeing unusual lights moving across the mountain's slopes, appearing and disappearing suddenly or hovering in place. These lights are interpreted by believers as evidence of Lemurian activity, craft entering or exiting the hidden city, energy phenomena associated with the advanced technology of Telos, or perhaps the illuminated forms of the Lemurians themselves. However, mundane explanations readily account for most light sightings. Mount Shasta is regularly climbed, and climbers using headlamps at night create moving lights visible from great distances. The mountain's glaciers and snow fields can create unusual reflections of moonlight or distant city lights. Atmospheric phenomena, including various types of ice crystal reflections and refractions, can create apparently anomalous lights. Aircraft passing in the distance can appear to be on or near the mountain from certain viewing angles. When investigated in detail, most light sightings turn out to have prosaic explanations. But in the absence of investigation and in the context of belief in hidden civilizations, witnesses interpret these lights as confirmation of the legend. The lights become evidence not through careful analysis, but through presumption, the assumption that because the legend exists, any unexplained light must be related to it. Another category of reports involves encounters with mysterious individuals who are interpreted as Lemurians. These stories typically follow a pattern. Someone in or near the town of Mount Shasta encounters a tall, striking individual who seems otherworldly in some subtle way, perhaps unusually serene, or speaking with an unusual accent, or wearing clothing that seems slightly out of place. The encounter is usually brief, and the mysterious individual typically says little but leaves the witness with a profound feeling of peace, elevation, or significance. When the witness tries to learn more about the individual or attempts to follow them, the person vanishes mysteriously, turns a corner and is gone, or is simply no longer visible when the witness looks away and back. These encounter stories are classic examples of how ordinary experiences can be reinterpreted through the lens of belief. A tall person wearing unusual clothing in a tourist town, which Mount Shasta certainly is not particularly mysterious. The feelings of significance or awe that witnesses report are common psychological responses to encounters that the witness has primed themselves to find meaningful. The mysterious disappearance is typically just the person walking away or entering a building while the witness was distracted. But when someone expects to potentially encounter Lemurians and has a specific image of what such an encounter would be like, ordinary experiences can be interpreted as extraordinary. The psychological tendency toward confirmation bias, noticing and remembering experiences that fit expectations while ignoring those that do not, ensures that such reinterpretations are common. More elaborate encounter claims involve individuals who report being taken into the mountain, either physically or in some kind of out-of-body experience, and shown the underground city. These reports are similar to alien abduction narratives or shamanic journey accounts. The witness describes being transporting to another realm, experiencing wonders, receiving teachings, and then returning to ordinary consciousness. The descriptions provided in these accounts are remarkably consistent, which believers take as evidence of genuineness. Different people seeing the same real place should report similar features. However, skeptics note that the consistency more likely reflects the fact that all the witnesses have been exposed to the same cultural materials, the same books, the same channelings, the same descriptions of Telos circulating in the spiritual seeker community. When people familiar with the Telos legend have experiences they interpret as visiting the underground city, they naturally describe what they have been told the city looks like. Their experiences conform to expectations shaped by prior exposure to the legend. This is exactly what we would expect if the experiences were imaginative or hallucinatory rather than literal visits to a real location. Some encounter reports come from people using psychedelic substances or other consciousness-altering techniques in the vicinity of Mount Shasta. Visitors to the mountain sometimes engage in vision quests, extended meditation retreats, or ceremonies involving entheogens, hoping to facilitate contact with the Lemurians or ascended masters. Experiences during these altered states are then reported as encounters with the hidden civilization. However, experiences during altered states of consciousness, while personally meaningful and potentially valuable for the experiencer, cannot serve as evidence for external realities. Psychedelic experiences reflect the interaction between brain chemistry, set and setting, and the individual's prior beliefs and expectations. They can feel profound and real, but they are generated internally rather than representing perception of external entities or locations. A particularly interesting category of reports involves photographs or videos purporting to show evidence of unusual phenomena at Mount Shasta. The internet has made it easy to share such images, and believers circulate photographs showing unusual cloud formations, odd lights, or strange shapes that are claimed to be Lemurian craft or manifestations. However, examination of these images typically reveals mundane explanations. Unusual cloud formations around Mount Shasta are common due to orographic effects. The mountain's size and height create distinctive weather patterns. What appears to be a mysterious light is often lens flare, a reflection, or a misidentified conventional aircraft. Shapes that seem anomalous are typically artifacts of digital compression, shadows, or known atmospheric phenomena. The problem with photographic evidence is that cameras capture phenomena that the human eye and brain interpret differently. Artifacts of the photographic process can create images that look anomalous, but have technical rather than mysterious explanations. Without expertise in photography, atmospheric optics, and image analysis, viewers can easily misinterpret perfectly normal phenomena as evidence of the extraordinary. Finally, there are reports from people who claim to have found physical evidence of Lemurian activity, unusual crystals, manufactured objects that seem out of place, or traces of construction in remote areas of the mountain. However, when such claims are investigated, they invariably turn out to involve misidentification of natural features, ordinary human artifacts from climbers or historical activity in the region, or unverifiable claims with no actual evidence presented. What is striking about all these encounter and sighting reports is that none provide the kind of clear, unambiguous, independently verifiable evidence that would convince skeptics or establish the existence of a hidden civilization. Every report has alternative explanations, involves ambiguous evidence, or rests entirely on the subjective interpretation of the witness. This pattern is not unique to Mount Shasta. It is characteristic of all paranormal and anomalous phenomena claims. Believers interpret this pattern as indicating a reality that reveals itself selectively or subtly. Skeptics interpret the same pattern as indicating that the phenomena are not real, but are instead misinterpretations, psychological experiences, or deliberate fabrications. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Mount Shasta legends had become thoroughly integrated into the local economy and culture. The town of Mount Shasta transformed from a declining logging and railroad town into a spiritual tourism destination where believers and seekers could explore the mysteries, purchase related materials, and participate in a community organized around the legends. Downtown Mount Shasta features numerous shops catering to the spiritual-seeking clientele. Crystal shops sell minerals and gemstones claimed to have special properties, including crystals supposedly from or energized by Telos. Bookstores stock extensive sections on Lemuria, channeled teachings, and Mount Shasta mysteries. Retailers offer ritual items, meditation supplies, and artwork depicting Lemurians and ascended masters. Tour companies provide guided experiences, trips to supposedly significant locations on the mountain, visits to power spots and vortexes, and meditation sessions at locations associated with the legends. Some guides claim to be able to facilitate contact with the Lemurians or to help visitors access hidden dimensions. These tours range from relatively modest nature hikes with spiritual commentary to elaborate multi-day retreats involving ceremonies and teachings. Lodging options include retreat centers, healing sanctuaries, and spiritual guest houses where visitors can stay while exploring the region's mysteries. These facilities often offer workshops, classes, and healing sessions taught by local spiritual teachers and practitioners who have based their careers on the Mount Shasta legends. The town hosts numerous conferences, festivals, and gatherings centered on spiritual themes and the Telos legend. Events like the Mount Shasta Goddess Conference, various UFO and metaphysics conferences, and channeling sessions draw visitors from around the world. These events generate significant economic activity for the town while reinforcing and elaborating the legends through talks, workshops, and communal experiences. This commercial ecosystem creates economic incentives for perpetuating the legends. Local businesses benefit from the spiritual tourism, and individuals make livings as teachers, authors, guides, and healers based on Mount Shasta's mysterious reputation. This does not necessarily mean that all or even most participants are cynically exploiting belief for profit. Many are sincere believers themselves, but it does mean that economic interests align with maintaining and promoting the legends. The cultural impact extends beyond commerce. The town has developed a distinct identity as a spiritual center, and many residents, even those who are skeptical about Lemurians, appreciate the peaceful, nature-focused atmosphere that the spiritual-seeking community has helped create. The emphasis on meditation, healing, and environmental awareness has positive aspects regardless of the factual status of the underlying legends. However, there are also tensions and negative impacts. Some longtime residents and indigenous peoples express frustration with the appropriation and commercialization of sacred landscapes. The characterization of Mount Shasta as home to Lemurians overshadows and sometimes displaces the genuine indigenous traditions and relationships with the mountain. The influx of spiritual seekers has changed the character of the town in ways that not all residents welcome. Moreover, the commercial ecosystem around the legends creates environments where critical thinking is discouraged and where vulnerable people can be exploited. When someone's livelihood depends on selling books, workshops, or healing sessions based on the Telos legend, they have incentive to reinforce belief rather than encourage skeptical inquiry. Visitors seeking help, meaning, or healing may be offered expensive services based on claims that cannot be verified and practices that may not be effective. If the legends of Telos and the Lemurians were true, if a sophisticated civilization of thousands or even millions of beings lived inside Mount Shasta, certain physical evidence should exist and be discoverable. The complete absence of this expected evidence is one of the strongest arguments against the literal truth of the legends, though it is an argument that believers have developed elaborate frameworks to dismiss. First and most obviously, there should be entrances. A city housing a significant population requires access points for air circulation, for bringing in supplies, for the movement of inhabitants. These entrances might be hidden or camouflaged, but they must exist somewhere on the mountain's surface. Given that Mount Shasta is extensively explored by thousands of climbers, hikers, and researchers annually, and given that its slopes are documented by high-resolution satellite imagery and aerial photography, hidden entrances of sufficient size to serve a large underground population should have been discovered. Believers explain the absence of discovered entrances through various mechanisms. Some claim the entrances are protected by advanced technology that renders them invisible or creates illusions, making them appear as solid rock. Others suggest the entrances exist in higher dimensions and can only be accessed by those who have raised their consciousness to the appropriate vibrational frequency. Still others propose that the entrances are guarded and that anyone who approaches is telepathically turned away or has their memory erased. These explanations are conveniently unfalsifiable. They can explain any absence of evidence while requiring no actual evidence of their own. This is a hallmark of pseudoscientific claims. When predictions fail or expected evidence is absent, the theory is modified in ways that preserve the core belief while explaining away the problems. Second, there should be waste heat and exhaust. A city housing thousands of people requires energy for lighting, heating, food production, and various technological systems. Even with highly efficient technology, thermodynamics requires that energy use generates waste heat. A large underground population would create a heat signature detectable by thermal imaging. Similarly, any combustion processes or industrial activities would require air intake and exhaust, creating airflow that would be detectable at surface vents. Thermal surveys of Mount Shasta conducted for geological monitoring show heat signatures consistent with an active volcano, with a magma chamber deep beneath the surface, but no anomalies suggesting large-scale energy use in chambers at shallower depths, where the city is supposedly located. Air movements around the mountain are entirely consistent with natural geological and atmospheric processes, with no unexplained exhaust vents. Believers sometimes claim that Lemurian technology is so advanced and efficient that it produces no waste heat, or that it operates on entirely different principles than surface technology, drawing energy directly from the Earth's core or from zero-point energy fields. Again, these are explanations designed to explain away absent evidence rather than being based on positive evidence of their own. Third, there should be seismic evidence. Seismographs monitor Mount Shasta continuously as part of volcano hazard assessment. These sensitive instruments detect underground vibrations and can map subsurface structures by analyzing how seismic waves travel through different materials. Large hollow chambers would create distinctive seismic signatures, as waves would travel differently through air-filled spaces than through solid rock. The seismic data from Mount Shasta shows what geologists expect: a solid stratovolcano with the typical internal structure of such mountains, including a deep magma chamber, but no large hollow spaces at the depths where Telos is supposedly located. The mountain's interior is well characterized by seismology, and it does not contain the vast caverns the legends describe. Believers respond that Lemurian construction techniques create chambers that are somehow invisible to seismic detection, or that the city exists in a dimension that does not interact with physical instruments, or that the authorities monitoring the volcano are part of a cover-up and are falsifying the seismic data. Each explanation becomes more elaborate and more implausible, requiring increasingly extraordinary mechanisms to preserve the core belief. Fourth, there should be evidence of resource extraction. A population of even moderate size requires food, water, raw materials for construction and manufacturing, and energy sources. Even if we grant hypothetically that an underground city could exist, it would need to obtain resources from somewhere. This would require either extensive underground agriculture and manufacturing, which would have their own detectable signatures, or procurement of resources from the surface world, which would leave evidence of trade, purchasing, or extraction. The stories of Lemurians appearing in Mount Shasta stores to purchase supplies with gold nuggets are often cited as evidence of such procurement, but as we have noted, these stories are unverified urban legends with no documentary support. No store owner has produced photographs of mysterious customers. No gold nuggets of unusual provenance have been analyzed. No pattern of unexplained purchases has been documented. The stories exist only as folklore, not as verified facts. Fifth, there should be waste disposal evidence. A large population generates waste, sewage, garbage, manufacturing byproducts. This waste must go somewhere. Even with advanced recycling technology, some waste streams are inevitable. An underground city would need to dispose of waste either by processing it internally, which would require energy and would generate heat, or by transporting it to the surface, which would leave evidence. No unexplained waste streams disposal sites, or processing facilities have been found on or around Mount Shasta. Believers sometimes claim that Lemurian technology achieves perfect recycling with no waste, or that waste is transporting to other dimensions. These claims are scientifically implausible and amount to invoking magic to solve practical problems. Sixth, there should be defectors or accidental discoveries. In any large population, even one committed to secrecy, there will be individuals who disagree with the policy of concealment, who want to reveal themselves to the surface world, or who accidentally expose the secret. Across thousands of years of supposed concealment, with thousands or millions of inhabitants, the probability of maintaining perfect secrecy approaches zero. Human history shows repeatedly that secrets are difficult to keep even in small groups over short periods. Large conspiracies involving many people invariably leak through defectors, accidents, or documentation. The Manhattan Project, a genuine large-scale secret project, was known to Soviet intelligence almost from its inception, despite elaborate security measures. The idea that an entire civilization could maintain perfect secrecy for millennia strains credibility beyond the breaking point. The occasional individuals who claim to be from Telos, like Shasta ducks, are the exceptions that might seem to prove the rule. But investigation of such claims reveals inconsistencies and lack of verification, suggesting these are not genuine defectors from a hidden civilization, but individuals making unsubstantiated claims for various personal reasons. Finally, there should be archaeological and geological evidence of the excavation or construction of such a massive underground space. Creating chambers large enough to house a city would require removing enormous quantities of rock. This spoil would need to be deposited somewhere. The construction process, even with advanced technology, would leave traces in the geological record, tool marks on walls, evidence of artificial modifications to natural caves, anomalies in the rock structure. Geologists studying Mount Shasta have found no evidence of artificial excavation or construction. The mountain's structure is entirely consistent with natural volcanic processes. The small lava tube caves that do exist are clearly natural formations with none of the characteristics that would indicate artificial modification on the scale required for a city. The cumulative absence of all these expected evidences creates what is called the silence of evidence problem. When multiple independent lines of evidence all fail to support a claim, and when this absence of evidence occurs precisely where evidence should exist if the claim were true, the most parsimonious conclusion is that the claim is false. Believers interpret this same situation differently. For them, the absence of conventional evidence proves the superiority of Lemurian technology and spiritual advancement. The fact that the city cannot be detected by physical instruments demonstrates that it operates according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The perfect maintenance of secrecy demonstrates the discipline and wisdom of the Lemurians. Every absent piece of evidence becomes, through interpretive gymnastics, evidence of the very thing it seems to contradict. This interpretive framework is psychologically satisfying for believers because it is completely closed. No possible observation or lack of observation can challenge the belief, because everything can be reinterpreted to support it. But from a rational, evidential standpoint, a claim that can explain all possible observations equally well is a claim that explains nothing. It is unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. Understanding why the Mount Shasta legends persist despite the lack of supporting evidence requires examining the psychological needs, cognitive biases, and social factors that sustain belief in the face of contrary evidence. One fundamental factor is the human need for meaning and transcendence. Life can seem meaningless, mundane, or disappointing. The idea that there exists a hidden realm of perfected beings, that spiritual advancement is real and achievable, that humanity is on the cusp of a great transformation. These ideas provide meaning, hope, and purpose. They transform the world from a random, indifferent place into a cosmos with direction, hidden helpers, and ultimate significance. Mount Shasta, as a spectacular and genuinely awe-inspiring natural feature, provides a perfect focal point for these needs. The mountain is beautiful, dramatic, and mysterious in the ordinary sense of being remote and wild. The experience of being in the presence of such a mountain naturally evokes feelings of awe, insignificance, and connection to something greater. These genuine feelings can then be interpreted through the lens of belief as evidence of the mountain's special spiritual properties or hidden inhabitants. This is a form of what psychologists call the numinous experience, the feeling of encountering the sacred or transcendent. Such experiences are real psychological events with measurable neurological correlates. People do genuinely feel awe, peace, or spiritual presence when in powerful natural settings or during meditation and ritual. The question is not whether these experiences occur, but how to interpret them. Believers interpret numinous experiences at Mount Shasta as evidence of Lemurians, ascended masters, or other elements of the legend. Skeptics interpret the same experiences as natural psychological responses to the mountain's grandeur, to the social context of being with other believers, and to the expectations created by prior exposure to the legends. Both interpretations account for the experiences themselves, but only the skeptical interpretation does so without requiring the existence of unverified entities and realms. Another psychological factor is the human tendency toward pattern-seeking and agency detection. Our brains are wired to find patterns and to attribute events to intentional agents. These tendencies were adaptive in our evolutionary past. Better to mistakenly see a pattern that doesn't exist or attribute agency to a random event than to miss a real pattern or real agent that could be important for survival. But these same tendencies can lead us to find meaningful patterns in random data and to attribute natural events to intentional causes when no such causes exist. When someone sees unusual lights on Mount Shasta, the pattern-seeking brain wants to explain them, and the agency detection system suggests they might be caused by intelligent beings. If the person already knows about the Lemurian legend, that explanation is readily available and satisfying. Confirmation bias powerfully reinforces initial beliefs. Once someone accepts the basic framework of the Mount Shasta legends, They will tend to notice and remember experiences that seem to confirm the beliefs while ignoring or forgetting experiences that contradict them. The one time they see an unusual light becomes evidence of Lemurians. The 100 times they see nothing unusual are forgotten as unremarkable. This bias is unconscious and automatic, affecting even people who pride themselves on being rational and open-minded. It is not a character flaw, but a feature of how human cognition operates, and being aware of the bias is the first step toward compensating for it. Social factors are equally important. Belief in the Mount Shasta legends provides access to a community of like-minded individuals who share values, interests, and worldviews. This community provides friendship, support, and a sense of belonging. For people who feel alienated from mainstream society, who are interested in spirituality but dissatisfied with conventional religion, or who have unconventional beliefs and experiences, the Mount Shasta spiritual community offers acceptance and validation. The social rewards of belonging to this community can be powerful enough to sustain belief even when individuals privately have doubts. Expressing skepticism risks social rejection, loss of friendships, and exclusion from a valued community. This creates social pressure to maintain belief, or at least to avoid public doubt, even when private certainty wavers. Moreover, many people have made significant investments of time, money, and identity in the Mount Shasta legends. They have spent years studying the material, attending workshops, perhaps even relocating to Mount Shasta to be near the supposed hidden city. They have built their self-concept around being spiritually advanced seekers in contact with higher dimensions. Admitting that the legends are false would require abandoning these investments and restructuring their identity, a psychologically costly process that most people resist. This phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance reduction, leads people to double down on beliefs when confronted with contrary evidence. Rather than admitting they were wrong, which would create uncomfortable cognitive dissonance between their beliefs and reality, people reinterpret the contrary evidence as actually supporting their beliefs or dismiss it through various rationalization strategies. The Mount Shasta legends also appeal to anti-authoritarian impulses and to feelings of possessing special knowledge. The claim that mainstream science and authorities are either ignorant of or covering up the truth about Telos positions believers as enlightened insiders who know what others do not. This is psychologically gratifying, providing a sense of superiority and specialness. This dynamic is common in conspiracy theories and alternative belief systems generally. The world is divided into the awakened and the sleeping, the enlightened and the ignorant, those who know the truth and those fooled by lies. Believers cast themselves as the awakened, enlightened truth knowers, which is a far more flattering self-concept than accepting that they might be mistaken in believing unsupported claims. Finally, there is the role of extraordinary experience and altered states of consciousness. Many believers report profound personal experiences that convince them of the reality of Lemurians or hidden realms. These experiences, whether during meditation, psychedelic journeys, or spontaneous mystical moments, feel utterly real and transformative. They create unshakable personal conviction that cannot be easily challenged by abstract arguments about evidence. The mistake is in assuming that the reality of the experience implies the reality of its literal interpretation. A person can have a genuine, profound experience of feeling transporting to an underground city and encountering luminous beings without there actually being an underground city or beings. The experience can be entirely real as a psychological event, while the entities and realms encountered are creations of the mind rather than external realities. Brain science increasingly understands how such experiences are generated. Certain meditation practices, psychedelic substances, sensory deprivation, rhythmic movement, and other techniques can alter normal consciousness in ways that produce vivid imagery, feelings of profound significance, encounters with seeming entities, and convictions of access to hidden truths. These experiences are neurologically real, but do not provide reliable information about external reality. Understanding these psychological factors does not make believers irrational or foolish. These are normal human tendencies operating in a context where they lead to false conclusions. We are all subject to these biases and needs. The difference is in whether we recognize and compensate for them or whether we allow them to determine our beliefs uncritically. One of the most important distinctions for understanding the Mount Shasta phenomenon is between spiritual experience and literal factual claims. This distinction is often blurred in the discourse around Telos and Lemurians, leading to confusion about what is actually being claimed and what kinds of evidence would be relevant. There is no doubt that Mount Shasta is a powerful place that inspires profound experiences in many people. The mountain's grandeur, its pristine wilderness, the quality of light and air at high altitude, the sense of being in a landscape minimally touched by human development. All these factors create conditions conducive to experiences of awe, peace, and connection. People who visit Mount Shasta often report feeling spiritually refreshed, gaining insights during meditation, experiencing healing of emotional wounds, or feeling connected to something greater than themselves. These experiences are real and valuable. They can be transformative and meaningful regardless of whether Lemurians exist or whether the mountain is hollow. From a psychological and spiritual perspective, Mount Shasta functions as a sacred space, a place set apart from ordinary life, where people can engage in reflection, renewal, and practices aimed at personal growth and spiritual development. This function does not require the literal existence of hidden civilizations to be legitimate and valuable. Many religious and spiritual traditions recognize the value of sacred places without making literal claims about their geology or hidden inhabitants. A Buddhist might experience profound meditation at a mountain monastery without believing the mountain is hollow. A Christian might feel spiritual renewal in a cathedral without believing that angels literally dwell in its walls. The sacred quality of a place can be understood metaphorically, symbolically, or psychologically rather than literally. The problem arises when spiritual experiences at Mount Shasta are interpreted as literal evidence for the Telos legend. Someone has a profound meditation experience on the mountain and sees, in a visions, of a golden city. This experience could be interpreted as an encounter with one's own inner potential for harmony and perfection, projected outward and given form through the culturally available imagery of Telos. Or it could be interpreted as literally seeing the actual underground city. The first interpretation allows the experience to be meaningful and transformative, while remaining agnostic about or even denying literal underground civilizations. The second interpretation takes the experience as evidence for factual claims about the physical structure of the mountain and the existence of Lemurians, claims that can and should be evaluated using empirical evidence. This confusion between spiritual experience and literal claim is perpetuated by the language used in much Mount Shasta spiritual literature. Channeled messages and teachings often use language that hovers ambiguously between metaphor and literal description. Are the Lemurians actual physical beings living in physical chambers, or are they archetypal energies or aspects of higher consciousness symbolically represented as beings? Different sources give different answers, and individual believers may understand the claims at different levels of literalness. Some believe quite literally that tall, physically embodied Lemurians live in excavated chambers inside Mount Shasta and occasionally emerge to shop in town. Others understand the Lemurians more metaphorically or dimensionally, as beings that exist in some other plane or reality that intersects with Mount Shasta symbolically rather than geographically. This ambiguity is convenient because it allows the claims to be defended or reinterpreted depending on the challenge. When skeptics point out that the geology of the mountain makes hollow chambers impossible, believers can retreat to more metaphorical or dimensional interpretations. When believers want to claim evidential support from sightings or experiences, they can advance more literal interpretations. The claim shapeshifts to avoid falsification. A more honest approach would be to clearly distinguish spiritual and metaphorical meanings from literal, empirical claims. It is perfectly legitimate to say, "I find Mount Shasta to be a spiritually powerful place that inspires profound experiences and personal growth." The imagery of Telos and Lemurians is a rich symbolic system that helps me understand my spiritual journey. This is a claim about personal meaning and experience that does not require empirical verification. It is a different thing entirely to say, there is actually a city of Lemurians inside Mount Shasta, and they sometimes emerge and can be photographed. This is an empirical claim subject to verification or falsification through evidence. Many of the most thoughtful people engaged with Mount Shasta's spirituality maintain this distinction. They value the mountain as a sacred space and find the Telos mythology meaningful without necessarily believing it literally. They understand it as a modern myth that serves spiritual and psychological functions while remaining open to or agnostic about its factual status. Unfortunately, much of the popular literature and teaching does not maintain this distinction. It encourages literal belief while falling back on spiritual experience when challenged on evidence. This muddling is intellectually dishonest and does a disservice both to genuine spiritual experience and to rational inquiry. As we examine the cultural and spiritual impact of the Mount Shasta legends. We must return to the perspective of the indigenous peoples for whom Mount Shasta has been sacred for thousands of years. A sacredness not based on invented stories of Lemurians, but on actual cultural traditions, spiritual practices, and historical relationships with the mountain. The appropriation of Mount Shasta by the New Age and spiritual-seeking community has had concrete negative impacts on indigenous peoples and their relationship with the mountain. These impacts include the physical appropriation of sacred sites, the cultural appropriation of spiritual concepts, and the discursive appropriation that replaces genuine indigenous traditions with fabricated alternatives. Physically, the influx of spiritual seekers to Mount Shasta has led to overuse and degradation of certain sites that are sacred to indigenous peoples. Areas used for ceremony and prayer by native communities have become crowded with New Age practitioners conducting their own rituals, often without permission or respect for indigenous protocols. Sacred springs have been impacted by overuse. Fragile ecosystems have been damaged by increased foot traffic to supposed power spots. The Winnemem-Wintu and other tribes have repeatedly expressed frustration that their sacred places have been overrun by outsiders conducting ceremonies that are not based on indigenous traditions and that sometimes directly contradict indigenous values. When a sacred spring used for generations in Wintu ceremony becomes a tourist destination for crystal charging and energy work, the Wintu relationship with that place is disrupted and desecrated. Culturally, the Lemurian legend appropriates and distorts indigenous spiritual concepts. When New Age teachers speak of the mountain as sacred and as a dwelling place of powerful beings, they are using language that sounds indigenous, but actually replaces indigenous meaning with New Age invention. The indigenous understanding of the mountain as sacred, as the center of creation, as the dwelling place of the Creator and spiritual powers, is fundamentally different from the New Age understanding of it as hollow and housing Lemurians. When tourists arrive at Mount Shasta expecting to encounter Lemurians and instead hear about Wintu creation traditions, some dismiss these traditions as less interesting than the Lemurian legend they came seeking. The invented story crowds out the genuine tradition, not necessarily replacing it entirely, but diminishing its visibility and perceived importance. Moreover, the New Age presence at Mount Shasta sometimes explicitly claims to be honoring or recovering indigenous wisdom, while actually substituting fabricated alternatives. Teachers claim that the Lemurian legend is based on Native American traditions, that it represents ancient indigenous knowledge that was suppressed or forgotten, and that by promoting these ideas, they are supporting indigenous peoples. But when indigenous peoples themselves state clearly that these legends are not their traditions and that the appropriation is harmful, those claims are exposed as self-serving justifications. The Winnemem-Wintu have been particularly articulate in explaining how the New Age presence at Mount Shasta harms their community. The sheer volume of spiritual seekers makes it difficult for Wintu people to access their own sacred sites for private ceremony. The commercialization of the mountain's spirituality transforms a sacred relationship into a commodity, which is offensive to indigenous values. The positioning of invented New Age legends as equivalent to or even superior to genuine indigenous traditions is a continuation of the erasure and marginalization that indigenous peoples have experienced for centuries. Discursively, the Lemurian legend participates in the long history of denying indigenous presence and achievement. The idea that ancient Lemurians built or inhabited Mount Shasta before indigenous peoples, or that the mountain's spiritual significance derives from Lemurians rather than from indigenous traditions, implicitly positions indigenous peoples as secondary or even as recent arrivals to a landscape that was sacred before they arrived. This echoes the colonial narratives that justified dispossession by claiming that indigenous peoples were not the original inhabitants of the Americas, that earlier civilizations had built the impressive monuments and sites, and that contemporary native peoples had no legitimate claim to these places. The Lemurian legend is a modern version of this pattern, substituting Pacific Ocean survivors for Welsh princes or lost tribes of Israel, but serving a similar discursive function of displacing indigenous peoples from their own history and landscape. The harm is not merely abstract or academic. It has concrete impacts on indigenous land rights, cultural preservation, and self-determination. When sacred sites are overrun with New Age practitioners, when indigenous traditions are appropriated and distorted, when invented legends receive more attention and respect than genuine indigenous knowledge, the ability of indigenous communities to maintain their cultural practices and relationships with ancestral lands is undermined. Responsible engagement with Mount Shasta's genuine sacred qualities requires centering indigenous voices and perspectives. It requires recognizing that the mountain was sacred long before Frederick Spencer Oliver or Guy Ballard, that its sacredness is grounded in thousands of years of indigenous presence and practice, and that this indigenous relationship has priority over recent New Age inventions. It requires being willing to learn from indigenous peoples about their actual traditions rather than projecting invented alternatives onto them. It requires respecting indigenous protocols for sacred sites, including sometimes accepting that certain areas are not appropriate for non-indigenous access. It requires supporting indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, including indigenous peoples' right to control their own cultural narratives and sacred places. Most fundamentally, it requires honesty about what is indigenous tradition and what is modern invention. The Lemurian legend is not indigenous, it is not ancient, and it is not a recovery of suppressed indigenous wisdom. It is a modern mythology created primarily by non-indigenous people in the 20th century, drawing on theosophical occultism and science fiction as much as on any genuine indigenous tradition. Acknowledging this honestly is the first step toward more respectful engagement with both the mountain and the peoples for whom it has always been sacred. Many of the specific phenomena cited as evidence for the Telos legend have straightforward natural explanations that are more parsimonious than invoking hidden civilizations. Understanding these alternative explanations helps contextualize the evidence claims and shows how ordinary phenomena can be misinterpreted when filtered through belief. The mysterious lights seen on or around Mount Shasta are perhaps the most commonly cited evidence. But Mount Shasta's geographical situation and geological nature create conditions favorable to various optical phenomena that can appear mysterious to observers unfamiliar with them. Alpenglow, the reddish or pinkish illumination of mountainsides during sunrise and sunset, is particularly dramatic on Mount Shasta due to its size and isolation. The mountain can appear to glow when surrounding landscapes are in shadow, creating an effect that seems supernatural to those encountering it for the first time. Lenticular clouds, which form when moist air flows over mountains and cools, often appear as stacked, disc-shaped formations that can look like hovering crafts, especially when photographed. Mount Shasta is famous for producing spectacular lenticular clouds due to its height and isolation, and these are frequently misidentified as UFOs or mysterious phenomena. St. Elmo's fire, a corona discharge that appears as a blue or violet glow in strong electric fields, can occur on mountain peaks during storms. Climbers on Shasta occasionally report seeing this phenomenon, which can appear mysterious without understanding its electrical nature. Headlamps and lights from climbers are visible from great distances on a dark mountain. Climbers moving in a line create a string of moving lights that can appear anomalous to distant observers unfamiliar with the fact that the mountain is regularly climbed at night. The sounds sometimes reported, humming, rumbling, or musical tones, can be explained by various natural processes. Mount Shasta is an active volcano, and the movement of magma and geothermal fluids deep underground can create subtle vibrations and sounds. Glaciers produce sounds as they move and as ice breaks. Wind flowing over complex terrain can create whistling or humming tones through resonance effects. Avalanches, rockfall, and the cracking of ice produce loud noises that echo dramatically in mountain environments. Someone unfamiliar with these sounds might interpret them as machinery, explosions, or other anomalous phenomena rather than recognizing them as ordinary mountain sounds. The feelings of unusual energy or presence that many people report experiencing at Mount Shasta can be explained through a combination of psychological and physiological factors. High-altitude affects brain function through reduced oxygen, which can create feelings of euphoria, altered perception, and even hallucinations in some individuals. The physical exertion of hiking and climbing releases endorphins that can create feelings of well-being and transcendence. Being in a pristine natural environment away from urban stresses naturally promotes relaxation and openness. This is a genuine effect supported by environmental psychology research, but it does not require supernatural explanations. The psychological phenomenon of priming plays a significant role. People who arrive at Mount Shasta expecting to experience unusual phenomena are more likely to interpret ordinary sensations and perceptions as extraordinary. They are primed to notice anything that might be anomalous while ignoring the much larger body of completely ordinary experience. This is essentially a form of selective attention combined with confirmation bias. The visitor feels a sudden sense of peace while meditating and attributes it to Lemurian energy rather than to the natural effects of meditation in a beautiful setting. They see an unusual cloud formation and interpret it as a sign rather than as meteorology. They encounter someone in the town who seems serene and unusual and wonder if this might be a Lemurian rather than simply an ordinary person with a calm demeanor. The channeling phenomenon can be understood through the psychology of dissociation, imagination, and religious experience. Dissociative states, in which normal boundaries between different aspects of consciousness become fluid, can be induced through meditation, trance, or even simply relaxed attention. In these states, information that is actually generated by the person's own mind can be experienced as coming from an external source. This is not necessarily fraudulent or consciously fabricated. The channeler may genuinely experience their mental content as external communication, but psychological research shows that this experience does not require actual external entities. It can be entirely explained through known psychological processes. The content that emerges in channeling typically reflects the channeler's existing knowledge, beliefs, and cultural context. Channelers familiar with the Telos legend produce messages that align with that legend. They use language and concepts appropriate to their education and reading. The supposedly ancient or alien entities speak in modern English using contemporary New Age terminology, suggesting that the source is the channeler's own mind rather than an external being. As we approach the conclusion of our critical examination of the Mount Shasta legends, it is worth reflecting on the value of mystery itself and on the appropriate humility regarding the limits of knowledge. Not everything can or should be explained away, and maintaining openness to the possibility of genuine mystery is valuable even while being appropriately skeptical about specific unsupported claims. There are genuine mysteries about Mount Shasta, questions about its geological history that are not yet fully answered, aspects of its ecology that are not completely understood, and elements of indigenous traditions about the mountain that have not been fully documented or shared with outsiders. These genuine mysteries deserve respect and continued investigation. There is also the mystery of consciousness, of spiritual experience, and of the nature of reality itself. These philosophical and experiential mysteries are not resolved by dismissing Lemurian legends. Questions about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of non-ordinary states providing genuine insight, and the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality remain profound and open. A critical approach to the Telos legend does not require adopting a reductionist materialism that dismisses all spiritual experience as mere brain chemistry, or that claims science has definitively answered all important questions. It is entirely possible to maintain that consciousness and spiritual experience point toward aspects of reality not fully captured by current scientific models, while also maintaining that specific empirical claims require empirical evidence. The appropriate stance toward the Mount Shasta legends might be described as informed agnosticism combined with practical skepticism. Informed agnosticism acknowledges that we cannot prove with absolute certainty that no hidden civilization exists anywhere, that our knowledge is always incomplete, and that reality may contain aspects we do not currently understand. This prevents the arrogance of claiming absolute certainty while maintaining critical standards for belief. Practical skepticism recognizes that while absolute certainty is impossible, we can and should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. The evidence for Telos and Lemurians is essentially non-existent, consisting entirely of unverified testimony, experiences that have alternative explanations, and interpretations of ordinary phenomena through the lens of prior belief. Given this evidential situation, practical skepticism withholds belief while remaining open to changing that position if actual evidence emerges. This position allows for the value of Mount Shasta as a sacred space and as a location conducive to spiritual experience without requiring belief in literal hidden civilizations. It allows for the possibility that spiritual experiences at the mountain provide genuine insights into the nature of consciousness, connection, and meaning, even if they do not provide accurate information about underground cities. It also allows for engagement with the Telos mythology as a rich symbolic and narrative system that people find meaningful without requiring belief in its literal truth. Myths are powerful because they speak to deep psychological and spiritual needs, because they provide frameworks for understanding experience, and because they create communities of shared meaning. These functions are valuable regardless of whether the myths are factually accurate. What is important is maintaining honesty about the distinction between myth and fact, between spiritual experience and empirical claim, and between what we know and what we believe. The Mount Shasta legends become problematic not when people find them meaningful, but when they are presented as established facts, when evidence is claimed where none exists, and when skepticism is dismissed rather than engaged. If the Lemurian legends are not literally true, if there is no underground city of Telos, what does responsible engagement with Mount Shasta look like? How can we honor the mountain's genuine sacred qualities, respect the communities for whom it has always been sacred, and maintain intellectual integrity while still valuing the spiritual experiences many people have there? First, and most fundamentally, responsible engagement requires centering truth over comforting fiction. This means being willing to acknowledge when our beliefs are not supported by evidence, when we have accepted claims uncritically because they were emotionally appealing, and when we need to revise our understanding in light of what evidence actually shows. This does not mean abandoning spirituality or dismissing the value of experiences at Mount Shasta. It means distinguishing between the experiences themselves, which are real, and certain interpretations of those experiences, which may not be accurate. Someone can have a profound sense of peace while meditating on Mount Shasta without that experience proving the existence of Lemurians. The experience itself remains valuable and meaningful even when we do not interpret it as literal contact with hidden beings. Responsible engagement also requires respecting indigenous peoples' actual traditions and relationships with the mountain. This means several specific things. It means acknowledging that the Wintu, Karuk, Shasta, Modoc, and other peoples have sacred traditions about Mount Shasta that long predate modern New Age legends and that deserve priority of attention and respect. It means being willing to learn about these genuine traditions from indigenous sources rather than from New Age teachers who misrepresent or appropriate them. It means recognizing when our spiritual practices or beliefs are appropriative, when we are taking indigenous cultural elements out of context and using them in ways indigenous peoples find offensive or harmful. It means respecting indigenous protocols for sacred sites. Some areas may be restricted, not open to non-indigenous visitors, particularly for certain purposes or during certain times. This restriction should be honored rather than violated in the name of personal spiritual seeking. The desire to access power spots or energy vortexes does not override indigenous peoples' right to maintain boundaries around their sacred places. It means supporting indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, including in matters of cultural representation and land management. When indigenous communities state that certain activities or teachings are inappropriate or harmful, listening to and respecting those statements rather than defending our own desires for access and experience. Responsible engagement requires honoring the mountain as it actually is rather than as we imagine it to be. Mount Shasta is genuinely remarkable, a massive volcano of spectacular beauty, an ecological treasure supporting diverse life across multiple elevation zones, a source of water for vast areas downstream, and a landscape that has inspired reverence in humans for millennia. These genuine qualities are worthy of appreciation, protection, and spiritual response. The mountain does not need to be hollow or to contain Lemurians to be sacred. Its actual geological history, spanning hundreds of thousands of years of volcanic activity, is more awesome than any invented mythology. Its actual ecology, from the ancient forests at its base through alpine meadows to the glaciated summit, is more complex and worthy of study than fantasies about underground cities. Its actual significance to indigenous peoples, grounded in thousands of years of cultural practice and spiritual relationship, is more meaningful than recent New Age inventions. Responsible engagement means approaching the mountain with humility, recognizing that it is not ours to define or use according to our preferences, that it has significance and meaning independent of our projections, and that our spiritual experiences there are shaped as much by what we bring to the mountain as by what the mountain gives us. It means practicing environmental stewardship. The influx of spiritual seekers to Mount Shasta has environmental impacts, increased foot traffic eroding trails, overuse of fragile alpine areas, pollution from increased human presence. Responsible visitors minimize their impact, stay on established trails, pack out all waste, and avoid disturbing wildlife and vegetation. It means being critically aware of the commercial exploitation of the mountain's spiritual reputation. The ecosystem of shops, tour, workshops, and healing sessions generates revenue for many people, some of whom are sincere believers, and some of whom may be cynically exploiting others' spiritual hunger. Responsible engagement means being a critical consumer, asking for evidence for claims, being skeptical of expensive services promising access to hidden realms, and recognizing when spiritual teaching crosses into financial exploitation. It means cultivating genuine spiritual depth rather than collecting exotic experiences. The consumer approach to spirituality, visiting Mount Shasta to check it off a list of power spots, attending workshops to accumulate teachings from various traditions, seeking ever more exotic experiences, is ultimately unsatisfying. Depth comes from sustained practice, integration of teachings into daily life, and development of wisdom through reflection and application, not from the accumulation of spiritual experiences and credentials. Finally, responsible engagement means being honest with ourselves and others about what we actually know versus what we believe, hope, or imagine. It is one thing to say, "I find Mount Shasta to be a spiritually meaningful place where I have had profound experiences." It is another to say, "I know for a fact that Lemurians live inside Mount Shasta." The first statement is honest about the subjective nature of spiritual experience. The second makes an empirical claim that cannot be supported. Maintaining this honesty requires ongoing self-examination and willingness to admit uncertainty. It requires recognizing the difference between faith, which is belief without proof based on personal conviction or revelation, and knowledge, which is justified true belief based on evidence and reasoning. Both faith and knowledge have their place, but conflating them leads to confusion and poor thinking. The Mount Shasta phenomenon is not unique. Similar legends attach to many spectacular landscapes around the world. Mount Adams in Washington, the Superstition Mountains in Arizona, Sedona's Red Rocks, various mountains in the Himalayas and Andes. Understanding the pattern helps us see Mount Shasta not as a unique case, but as an example of a broader human tendency. Sacred places exist in every culture and religious tradition. Humans naturally designate certain locations as special, set apart from ordinary space, imbued with particular spiritual significance. These places serve important psychological and social functions. They provide locations for pilgrimage, ritual, and experiences of transcendence. They anchor communities and traditions to specific landscapes. They offer respite from ordinary life and opportunities for transformation. Indigenous peoples develop relationships with sacred places over generations or millennia, relationships embedded in cultural practices, oral traditions, and systems of meaning. These relationships are grounded in actual presence on the land, in detailed knowledge of place, developed through sustained attention, and in cultural continuity across time. Modern spiritual seekers, often disconnected from specific places by mobility and cultural displacement, hunger for sacred places but lack the deep cultural relationships that indigenous peoples maintain. This creates a vacuum that is filled by projecting meaning onto landscapes that seem spiritually powerful: mountains, deserts, canyons, ancient ruins. The projection draws on cultural materials readily available in modern pluralistic societies. Fragments of indigenous traditions, often misunderstood or romanticized, occult and esoteric philosophies like theosophy, science fiction and fantasy literature, New Age teachings, and personal mystical experiences interpreted through these various lenses. The resulting modern mythologies share common features across different locations. They typically involve ancient advanced civilizations whose wisdom has been preserved in hidden forms. They include hidden masters or evolved beings who guide humanity from secret locations. They propose that the sacred place is a portal, vortex, or power spot with unusual energy or dimensional properties. They suggest that the place will play a crucial role in humanity's coming spiritual transformation. These modern mythologies serve several functions. They provide meaning and narrative structure for spiritual experiences at these places. They create community among believers who share the mythology. They offer hope that humanity is evolving toward something better and that hidden helpers are working toward this goal. They position believers as spiritually advanced individuals who recognize truths that others miss. But these modern mythologies also cause harm. They appropriate and often displace indigenous traditions. They make empirical claims that cannot be supported and that encourage poor critical thinking. They can foster unhealthy detachment from ordinary reality and responsibility. They sometimes lead to financial exploitation of vulnerable seekers, and they obscure the genuine qualities of places by overlaying them with invented fantasies. A healthier approach to sacred places in modernity might involve several elements. It would acknowledge the genuine human need for sacred space and for experiences of transcendence, while being honest about the modern condition of displacement and the difficulties of creating authentic relationships with place in a mobile, pluralistic society. It would respectfully engage with indigenous traditions where appropriate and with permission, recognizing these as living cultural practices rather than resources to be extracted. It would support indigenous peoples' rights to their own sacred places and cultural practices. It would appreciate the natural qualities of powerful landscapes, their geology, ecology, and aesthetic magnificence as genuinely awe-inspiring without requiring supernatural embellishment. The natural history of a place can evoke the same sense of wonder and connection that myths of hidden civilizations do, while having the advantage of being true. It would cultivate depth of relationship with place through sustained attention, study, and presence, rather than collecting exotic locations and experiences. Becoming intimate with even an ordinary landscape, learning its rhythms and inhabitants across seasons and years, can create the sense of sacred connection that many seek in spectacular destinations. It would develop spiritual practices and communities that are grounded and embodied rather than primarily focused on hidden realms and extraordinary experiences. The mystical dimension of existence can be accessed through attention to the ordinary as much as through pursuit of the exotic. It would maintain honesty about the difference between subjective experience and objective fact, between what we feel and what we can prove, between faith and knowledge. This honesty need not diminish the value of spiritual experience. It simply locates that value appropriately in the realm of meaning and personal transformation, rather than in the realm of empirical fact. One of the most challenging philosophical questions raised by the Mount Shasta legends involves the relationship between truth and meaning. Can a story be meaningful and valuable even if it is not factually true? Does it matter whether the Lemurians exist if the belief in them helps people find meaning, community, and spiritual growth? This question touches on deep issues in philosophy of religion, epistemology, and the nature of narrative. Different philosophical traditions offer different answers. Pragmatism suggests that beliefs should be evaluated by their practical consequences rather than by their correspondence to reality. If belief in Lemurians makes someone's life better, then it is a good belief, regardless of whether Lemurians exist. Correspondence theories of truth insist that beliefs should match reality, that a belief is only properly valuable if it is actually true, and that false beliefs are ultimately harmful even if they seem beneficial in the short term. These are not easy questions with simple answers. But we can identify some relevant considerations. First, false beliefs can indeed provide comfort, meaning, and community in the short term. People have derived genuine benefit from many beliefs that we now know to be false. The question is whether these benefits could be obtained through true beliefs instead, and whether false beliefs carry hidden costs. In the case of Mount Shasta, the sense of meaning, the experiences of awe and transcendence, the community, and the spiritual growth that people seek can all be obtained without believing literally in Lemurians. The mountain is genuinely awe-inspiring based on its actual qualities. Spiritual practices work whether or not they are understood as connecting to hidden masters. Community can form around shared values and practices without requiring shared belief in unsupported claims. Moreover, false beliefs carry costs. They can lead to poor decision-making when people act on beliefs that do not match reality. They can create disillusionment when evidence eventually contradicts cherished beliefs. They can foster intellectual habits, accepting claims without evidence, dismissing contrary evidence, conspiracy thinking that harm people's ability to navigate other aspects of life. False beliefs about sacred places can specifically harm indigenous peoples through appropriation and displacement. They can lead to environmental damage when seekers flock to sensitive locations. They can enable financial exploitation when teachers and businesses profit from selling access to imaginary hidden realms. The distinction between myth and lie is crucial here. Myths are stories that a community recognizes as symbolic or paradigmatic narratives that convey meaning and values. Myths are not primarily about empirical facts, but about existential truths, moral principles, and cultural identity. A community can deeply value its myths while understanding that they function symbolically rather than literally. Lies or delusions are false statements presented as facts or believed as facts when they are not. The Lemurian legend becomes problematic when it crosses from functioning as modern myth into being presented and believed as empirical fact about the mountain's structure and inhabitants. If the Mount Shasta spiritual community could collectively shift to understanding the Lemurian narrative as meaningful mythology without requiring literal belief, many of the problems would dissolve. People could value the story for what it reveals about human aspirations for perfected society, spiritual evolution, and connection to higher wisdom, without needing to claim that it describes actual beings in actual chambers. But this shift would require several changes. It would require honesty from teachers and authors, who currently present channeled material and encounter stories as factual. It would require believers to examine why they need the story to be literally true rather than symbolically meaningful. It would require the community to develop new ways of talking about the mountain and their experiences there that do not depend on claims about hidden civilizations. Whether such a shift will occur remains uncertain. The economic and psychological investments in literal belief are substantial, and the loss of the literal dimension might feel like a loss of magic, mystery, and significance. But the gain would be integrity, alignment between beliefs and evidence, between claims and reality, and liberation from the need to defend increasingly untenable positions against mounting contrary evidence. What will happen to the Mount Shasta Lemurian legends in the coming decades? Will they fade as the New Age movement evolves and new generations bring different spiritual interests? Will they persist and perhaps even strengthen as part of an alternative reality community that becomes increasingly detached from consensus reality? Or will they transform into something new, perhaps becoming more explicitly mythological and symbolic? Several factors will influence the trajectory. The internet and social media have made it easier than ever to spread alternative beliefs and to find communities of like-minded believers. Someone interested in Mount Shasta mysteries can find extensive material online, connect with believers worldwide, and have their beliefs reinforced without ever encountering serious skeptical challenge. This suggests the legends may persist in online communities even if interest in the physical location wanes. Conversely, the same internet that spreads alternative beliefs also provides access to skeptical analysis and debunking. Someone researching Mount Shasta will encounter not just believer websites, but also critical examinations like this one. Younger generations who have grown up with easy access to information may be more skilled at evaluating sources and identifying unreliable claims, potentially making them less susceptible to unsupported legends. The relationship between the legends and the town of Mount Shasta's economy may be entering a complex phase. The spiritual tourism that the legends attract brings revenue, but also brings complications: overcrowding of sensitive sites, conflicts between different groups of visitors, tension with residents who are not part of the spiritual seeking community. The town must navigate maintaining its appeal to spiritual tourists while addressing these complications. Climate change will affect Mount Shasta in ways that may influence the legends. The mountain's glaciers are receding visibly, the snowpack is changing, and fire risk is increasing in the surrounding forests. These changes might be interpreted by believers as signs of coming transformation or as evidence that the Lemurians are withdrawing their protective influence. Or they might focus attention on the mountain's genuine environmental challenges in ways that de-emphasize supernatural claims. Indigenous peoples' voices are becoming more prominent in discussions about sacred sites and cultural appropriation. As awareness grows about the harms of appropriation and the importance of indigenous sovereignty, it is possible that the mainstream culture will become less tolerant of legends that displace and misrepresent indigenous traditions. This could lead to a reassessment of the Lemurian legends and greater emphasis on genuine indigenous relationships with the mountain. The legends may also evolve in content as cultural preoccupations shift. Earlier versions emphasized ascended masters and spiritual teachings. Later versions added Lemurians and lost continents. Recent elaborations have incorporated concepts from quantum physics, consciousness studies, and dimensional shift theories. Future versions might incorporate whatever new cultural elements become available, perhaps artificial intelligence, transhumanism, or concepts we cannot yet anticipate. It is also possible that the legends will fade gradually as the generation most invested in them ages and younger spiritual seekers develop different interests. The New Age movement itself is changing, with newer expressions often more focused on wellness, mindfulness, and nature-based practices rather than on elaborate metaphysical cosmologies. Younger seekers may find the Lemurian legend dated or overly complicated compared to simpler approaches to spirituality. Whatever the future holds, the Mount Shasta legends will remain an important case study in how modern mythologies are created, how they spread, and what functions they serve. They document a particular moment in American spiritual culture, a set of needs and desires that led people to project elaborate fantasies onto a spectacular mountain, and the complex interplay between genuine spiritual seeking and the human capacity for self-deception. Throughout all the human stories, beliefs, and projections, Mount Shasta itself remains fundamentally unchanged. The mountain existed long before humans arrived in North America and will exist long after our species is gone. Its reality is independent of our interpretations, indifferent to our beliefs about what it contains or represents. This indifference is itself a kind of wisdom. The mountain does not care whether we believe in Lemurians or not. It does not reward believers or punish skeptics. It simply is a massive pile of volcanic rock, ice, and snow, following the slow rhythms of geological and ecological processes that operate on time scales that dwarf human concerns. The glaciers continue their grinding descent, carving imperceptibly at the rock beneath. Magma shifts deep underground, its movements registered by seismographs but unfelt by most humans. Snow falls in winter, accumulates, and melts in summer, feeding the streams that water the valleys below. Forests grow on the mountain's slopes, following the complex dynamics of succession, fire, and climate. Animals move through their territories, following ancient patterns of migration and behavior. The mountain is alive in its own way, but not in the way the legends suggest. There is something profound in recognizing the mountain's actual being as opposed to our projections onto it. The mountain teaches. If we are willing to learn that reality exists independent of our beliefs about it, that nature follows its own patterns regardless of our interpretations, and that there is beauty and meaning available to those who can see what is actually there rather than only what they wish to see. This does not mean the mountain is merely material, merely rock and ice without spiritual dimension. The experience of beauty, awe, and connection that people feel at Mount Shasta is real and significant. The mountain genuinely does inspire reverence, not because it contains hidden civilizations, but because it is magnificent, ancient, and powerful in ways that humble human pretensions and open awareness to scales of time and process beyond the everyday. The indigenous peoples who have related to this mountain for thousands of years understood something crucial. The mountain is sacred not because of what might be hidden inside it, but because of what it actually is: a living presence, a source of water and life, a connection between earth and sky. A reminder of forces greater than human power and understanding. This indigenous wisdom offers an alternative to both the reductionist materialism that sees the mountain as mere geology and the New Age fantasy that sees it as a hollow shell containing imaginary beings. The mountain is matter, yes, but matter that participates in relationships, that shapes and is shaped by living beings, that carries history and meaning through its very substance and form. Approaching Mount Shasta with this awareness, we can experience genuine connection, genuine awe, and genuine spiritual meaning without requiring supernatural embellishment. We can be present to the mountain as it is, in all its complexity and magnificence, and find that this is enough, more than enough, to inspire wonder, to provoke reflection, and to provide a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves. As we conclude this comprehensive examination of the Mount Shasta Lemurian legends, what final lessons can we draw? What should we take away from this journey through modern mythology, spiritual seeking, critical analysis, and the complex relationships between truth, meaning, and belief? First, we should recognize the power and persistence of human storytelling. The Mount Shasta legends are not ancient traditions, but modern creations, less than a century old in their current form. Yet they have spread widely, attracted devoted believers, shaped local culture and economy, and show no signs of disappearing. This testifies to how powerfully stories operate in human life, how readily we create and accept narratives that meet our needs for meaning, mystery, and transcendence. Second, we should understand the psychological and social factors that sustain belief in the absence of evidence. The believers in Lemurian Telos are not foolish or irrational in any absolute sense. They are human beings responding to genuine needs and drives: the need for meaning, for community, for connection to something greater, for hope that the world is more magical and purposeful than it often seems. The tragedy is that these genuine needs are being met through false beliefs that ultimately cannot satisfy because they are not true. Third, we should appreciate the importance of critical thinking and evidential standards. Not all claims are equally credible. Not all sources are equally reliable. Not all beliefs are equally justified. The ability to distinguish between claims supported by evidence and claims based on wishful thinking, between reliable and unreliable sources, between justified and unjustified beliefs, is essential for navigating a complex world full of competing truth claims. Fourth, we should recognize the harms caused by apparently harmless beliefs. The Lemurian legends might seem benign. If people find comfort and community in believing them, what is the harm? But as we have seen, the harms are real. Appropriation and displacement of indigenous traditions, environmental damage to sensitive locations, financial exploitation of vulnerable seekers, fostering of poor critical thinking habits, and the opportunity cost of investing energy in fantasies rather than in genuine spiritual development or in addressing real-world problems. Fifth, we should understand that spiritual experience and empirical claims are different categories requiring different types of validation. Someone can have profound spiritual experiences at Mount Shasta without those experiences proving anything about the mountain's geological structure or hidden inhabitants. Respecting this distinction allows us to value genuine spiritual experience while maintaining intellectual integrity about factual claims. Sixth, we should commit to honoring truth over comforting fiction. Reality may not always align with our wishes. The world may not contain hidden masters waiting to save us or lost civilizations preserving ancient wisdom for our benefit. But reality has its own profound depths, its own genuine mysteries, and its own sources of meaning. Choosing to engage with reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be is ultimately more satisfying and more productive of genuine wisdom than retreating into fantasy. Finally, we should recognize that Mount Shasta does not need Lemurians to be sacred, that the mountain's genuine qualities are more than sufficient to inspire reverence and spiritual response. The mountain's actual geological history, spanning hundreds of thousands of years of volcanic activity, is awesome in the truest sense. Its actual ecology, supporting diverse life from its base to its summit, is complex and worthy of study. Its actual significance to indigenous peoples, grounded in millennia of cultural practice, is profound and deserving of respect. The mountain stands, as it has stood for 500,000 years, indifferent to human fantasies and projections. Snow falls on its flanks and melts into streams that feed the valleys below. Forests grow on its slopes, following the rhythms of seasons and centuries. Wildlife moves through its territories according to ancient patterns. The mountain is sacred not because it is hollow, but because it is real, because it is magnificent, because it connects us to scales of time and process that transcend human concerns and remind us that we are part of something larger. We can approach this mountain with reverence, with awe, with openness to transformation and to experiences of transcendence, without requiring it to be anything other than what it is. We can have our spiritual experiences, our moments of insight and connection, our sense of touching something greater than ourselves, and we can do so while maintaining our commitment to truth, to evidence, to critical thinking, and to honesty. The choice between the fantasy of Lemurians and the reality of the mountain is, ultimately, a choice between comforting ourselves with agreeable fictions and engaging courageously with the world as it actually is. It is a choice between remaining in a bubble of belief, insulated from contrary evidence, and opening ourselves to reality in all its complexity. It is a choice between the immediate gratification of certainty and the more difficult, but ultimately more rewarding stance of honest uncertainty about what we do not and cannot know. Mount Shasta rises above the forests of Northern California, its glaciers gleaming in sunlight, its mass dominating the landscape for 100 miles in every direction. The mountain calls to us as it has called to humans for thousands of years. But what it calls us to is not hidden civilizations or secret wisdom preserved in underground chambers. It calls us to presence, to attention, to awe at what actually exists rather than at what we imagine. It calls us to humility before scales of time and power that dwarf human concerns. It calls us to recognize our place in a living world, our connection to geological and ecological processes that preceded us by millions of years and will continue long after we are gone. The hollow peak exists only in imagination. The real mountain, solid and ancient and magnificent, waits for those who are willing to see it as it is. That vision, grounded in truth rather than fantasy, offers a more profound spirituality than any invented legend ever could. The mountain's reality is enough. It has always been enough. And in choosing to engage with that reality rather than with comforting fictions, we honor both the mountain and ourselves.